Well, Jay, we were just looking it up. And in fact, this is the 6th special episode we've done with our good friend Will Page, and more to come, I'm quite sure.
And this one is a lot of fun. We talk about a new piece that Will has written, and the headline was "Music Smashes Box Office Records. Global Value of Music Copyright Soars to $45.5 billion, now worth more than cinema." And if you don't know by now, Will Page is an economist, an author, podcaster. Actually, he's a DJ too. Former chief economist at Spotify, fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, and a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics.
And a nice fellow.
He's also got a very nice fellow, and he's also got one of our very favorite podcasts called Bubble Trouble with Richard Kramer that we don't miss any episodes of. But it's always such a pleasure to talk to Will.
It certainly is. And so without further ado, Jay, I say we push the button and start the show right about now.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. 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 Standing by. Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Will Page, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you.
Like a boomerang. It's great to be back.
We always enjoy it.
Yes. Before we jump in, I just wanted to talk about your data sources really quickly, because for those that don't know, we throw around some of these abbreviations and acronyms, RIAA, IFPI. There was a new one in here for me, this CISAC, not to be confused with CSAC, the Society of European Stage Authors and Composers. Talk a little bit about your data sources.
The alphabet soup of acronyms.
Yes.
Totally.
I'll keep it as simple as 3. You have the IFPI, which publish their global annual music report.
Yep.
And that covers the record labels and the artists. Then you have CSAC with the C, not an S. That covers the collective management organizations. For more acronyms, that's the ASCAPs, BMI, SACEMs, PRSs of this world. And then lastly, you have the publishers who license income directly. So for that, my source is Music and Copyright, a well-known broadsheet publication in the industry. Simon Dyson and the team at Omdia are responsible for that one, and I use that one too to complete the picture. So I have labels, CMOs, and publisher direct income. Add A, B, C, go into a back cave, do all your adjustments, and come back out with D, which is the global value of music copyright, to present on your Morning Coffee podcast.
Yay. And the global value of copyright in calendar year 2023 reached $45.5 billion. That is a big number. Let's ask you to put that in context for us.
Big on 3 levels. 1, 45.5 is closer to 50 than it is 40. So we are moving towards an industry that begins with a 5. Not a 2, which is where originally Fruit started its journey, but now getting closer to beginning with a 5. That's very likely next year. That dovetails into point 2, which is when it does begin with a 5, that means it will have doubled within a decade. What other media industry can claim that? So we start off at 25 billion. Next year, when I calculate 2024, sorry for moving your calendar mindsets around a little here, we could be looking at 50 billion. And then 3, I think the most interesting tipping point here, and it's a bit of a curveball to throw at the audience, is that the value of music copyright today has now overtaken that of cinema. It's a really interesting benchmark. If you said that in 2019, you'd have been laughed out of the room. But you can say it with mathematical fact in 2023.
Remarkable.
Amazing. So you mentioned CMOs. For those with no prior knowledge, I stole that from you. Talk about what a CMO is.
The head of a very famous CMO in America said that they're 100-year-old startups. I mean, they've been around for a long time. In fact, they've been around since 1849, where they were founded in France with the organization SACEM. We can get into that story in a minute if you have time.
Sure.
But essentially, for the songwriters and publishers, you have this performing right that you can license to hairdressers, hotels, radio stations, TV stations. And it makes sense to have a collective pool of rights and to sell them in their entirety. So this is where you get the term the blanket license. You're not paying for a particular right or a particular catalogue. You're paying a one-stop fee to cover all the rights in the world. And that makes the transaction, the trade between copyright holder and copyright user, really simple and really efficient. These organizations have struggled to move with the times, but the principle of collective licensing is a genius one. It's how radio and TV works, you know?
Of these collecting societies that we talk about, what was the first one?
The first one was SACEM, and the way it got started is it's got a few twists and turns to it. A French composer in 1849, Bourget, went to a restaurant and asked for a glass of salted water, you know, simple glass, and noticed that they were charging extra for that water. He said, "Why are you charging extra?" And the restaurant said to him, "Well, I have to pay the band." These places were called café-cons, as in concerts and cafes. And he noticed the band was playing his music. So he turned around to the restaurant owner and said, "Well, if I have to pay more for this glass of water to pay the band, what about the songwriter?" And he said, "The songwriter is the least of my worries." He said, "Really? Well, I refuse to pay for this glass of water." And he got sued by the restaurant, went to court, and he lost. Then he says, "I'm not finished. I'll go to the Court of Appeal and try and overturn it because I offered enrichment to that venue just like the band did because I wrote the compositions that the band were performing." And he won on the Court of Appeal. Wow. And because of that glass of water and because of that Court of Appeal decision, he was allowed to form a collective with 12 or 13 other French composers, which would run around the restaurants of Paris for them in 1851, and they were called SACEM. So that is the most expensive glass of water that's ever been purchased. For them to say
so
the songwriter is the least of my concerns was not a wise thing to have said.
No.
Oh, my God.
Great story.
Fascinating. How does the overall pie look with recorded revenues, CMO collections, and direct publisher income?
So when you add up the entire value of the copyright industry and you hit this incredible number of 45.5 billion, well, you can split it up. And what I like to do is to split up into two pieces. You look at how much goes to the songwriters, publishers, and their CMOs, and that is 37% of that $45.5 billion pie, which leaves 63% to go to record labels and artists. Now, that's not 50-50, obviously, and that might raise some questions. An intuitive one is to say, is that fair? Is it fair that Spotify pays the record label $1 and then pays the publisher 30-odd cents? Is it fair that here in the UK, if your song's played on radio, the songwriter and the publisher gets £90 and the record label and the artist gets £60? Is that fair? But these imbalances are all across the copyright landscape. In some areas you do well, in other areas you do less well. The publishers, they typically do well in business-to-business licensing the stadiums, the hotels, the restaurants, the radio stations. Record labels, they do better in consumer licensing, the vinyl, the CD, the downloads, the streams. So there's winners and losers all over the map, but it's nice to kind of throw the whole thing together and ask who got what share. Broadly speaking, just over a third goes to the songwriters, just under 2/3 goes to the artists.
So you talked about the supply and demand for vinyl in this report. Tell us what you learned about vinyl.
At risk of repeating myself, we got to wake up to this vinyl. It is not a footnote. It's not a rounding error. It's not a blip. It's not even a trend. It's now a large part of the music industry. And It's a large part in so many different ways, but the exclusive bomb that I dropped in this year's report, that in this year, that is 2024, the report obviously refers to what happened last year in 2023, but in this year, 2024, record labels in America alone are going to gross $1 billion from vinyl, a format that was declared dead back in the hairspray 80s. It's remarkable. $1 billion business for American record labels alone. And remember, publishers get paid too. And remember, that's just one country. This is a massive business. And it's also the fastest growing business in percentage terms. So it's a really important thing to acknowledge is, A, it's not a small piece of the pie anymore. And B, it's growing faster than any other piece of the pie you can name. So this thing is going to keep going and going. And I work closely with Fred Goldring, a long-time mentor of mine, and part of the Goldring Hertz double act that ran Hollywood Law for so many years. And we were looking at vinyl as, where it could go next. We put out an op-ed in Billboard looking at vinyl as a first mover strategy. Put the vinyl out first, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, put it on streaming second. That article went out in Billboard in sort of March, April time. A few months later, we got a call from a record label saying that their artists had put theory into practice and had done that. Now, I'm not sure if I can name the artist here on your show, but this artist, very famous artist, put out a $40 version of the vinyl, $50 version of the vinyl, and a $60 version of vinyl all 3 weeks before release date. Now, let me ask you, Jay, which version do you think sold out the fastest?
Probably the most expensive one.
Bingo. And that means, in economic terms, you have a Veblen good, where price signals perceived quality equals demand. You cannot get $50 or $60 from a fan from streaming. It just ain't going to happen. It's mathematically impossible for that to happen, but you can from vinyl. And I think, supply creates demand. What's held vinyl back up until recently is the lack of supply. We're seeing plants like Pressing Business in Poland, GZ in Czech Republic, the pressing operations in the Netherlands. We're seeing operations in Austin and Memphis in America release these bottlenecks and allow supply to meet demand. And it's going to grow this vinyl business further and further. I don't see any reason why vinyl can't be as big as the book industry.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
Barnes & Noble's opening 40 stores to sell books. We all thought bookstores were dead.
Yeah.
What happens when those record stores start opening up around the country?
Yeah. I would also add to that argument, we had a vinyl roundtable discussion. Michael Kurtz from Record Store Day, Billy Fields, Bill Hine from Pressing Business. And one of the things we talked about was used vinyl, which is between 80 and 90% of the vinyl that's being sold today. And it's not being captured. So what you're talking about is just new vinyl. I think vinyl is much bigger than people think it is. Double.
Easily double. The second-hand market, that's huge. The car boot sales might sound trivial, but that's big too because it's across America. There'll be a car boot sale this weekend selling vinyl. And then you've got the online physical retailers. Like here in London, we have Juno, juno.co.uk, an online record store, maybe 22, 23 years in business. I sat with Richard Atherton there and we tried to work out how much vinyl are you shipping. We worked it out as one Arctic lorry a week is leaving that Camden depot and selling vinyl to Brazil, to China, to Italy, to around the world. That's not on the Luminate data set either. So we know that what matters most is measured least. We know what we can measure is big and getting bigger, but there's so much going on behind the shadows there in this vinyl marketplace that we need to factor into. It's a huge part of the business, maybe second to streaming. Well, clearly it's going to overtake CDs. In America, vinyl's 3 times the value of CDs. In Japan, I know it's a little funky, but pretty soon vinyl's going to be the second biggest revenue format for record labels worldwide.
Well, and so many people that are in the business now that weren't in the business the first go around of vinyl may not remember, but it's also now a one-way sale. There's no returns, and that's a dramatic difference just from a business standpoint as well.
Yeah, and the other thing which I think is making vinyl compete against CDs is it's so much easier to roll a spliff on a vinyl record than as a CD. I mean, you've got so much more space.
You sure do.
We're talking about utility here.
Right.
And one last thing. Imagine this. Imagine the K-pop revolution when we can unpack some of the stats on that. But let's just stick with vinyl for a second. K-pop is obviously a streaming phenomena with a CD backup. What happens if the team at Hybe say we want to do vinyl? business is going to treble.
Yeah. Yeah.
That could
Because it's
happen
fandom.
tomorrow.
It's almost a merch piece in some regards, because I'm a bigger fan of this band than you are, Will, because I've got it on the wall behind me on vinyl. It's consumption, but I think it's as much merch and fandom.
It's intimacy. It's the one thing the internet can't scale.
Right.
I got that record and you don't. You got another record, but that's not my record. What I got is my record.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And maybe one day I'm going to open it up and play it, but that's beside the point. At the moment, I got that record.
Well, let's shift back to streaming. Let's talk about streaming growth and what you call the North-South divide.
Yeah, this is to capture what I thought was a bit of confusion that happened this summer. In the space of like a fortnight, you had Luminate Data, great team, big shout to James, to Mary, to Scott, to Helena, the whole team there who are advancing that data set so well. But you had them producing reports saying, here's double-digit growth in streaming. And then you had Universal, who had their stock price get whacked because some analysts worked out that streaming was going to grow 4%. And there was some intuitive confusion there. We've got a big number here and a small number there. Volume seems to be doing great, but value seems to be doing less great. And that made me think about how economists tackle problems like this. I'm going to load quite a wordy term on you guys here called a trade-weighted exchange rate index. If I said to you, Mike, is the dollar up this week? You might say, against what? I said, I don't know, against whoever you trade with. Is the dollar getting stronger? Well, maybe you're getting stronger against the yen, but weaker against the euro. How much of your trade is with the yen and how much of your trade is with the euro allows you to calculate a balance position, which is the dollar on balance is up a little bit. Take that quite complex economic concept and apply it to this world. How much of the volume growth is coming from the poor south where there's not much value? And how much of the value growth is coming from the rich north where it's heavily concentrated? And in the work that I presented, I actually kind of calculated it out for the audience so we had some, for the first time, some proper numbers to kind of do this with. Let me just give you the two big headlines. The poor south, if I just block into two categories, Latin America, which includes Brazil, and Asia, which excludes Japan, made up just 12% of the value from 48% of the volume. Now, the rich north, which I'm going to summarize as North America and Europe, made up 80% of the value from 48% of the volume. And right there, Mike, you can see the imbalance. A lot of the volume growth is coming from where there's no value. A lot of the value growth is coming from places which isn't producing much volume growth. And that imbalance, that divergence is really important for not just the industry to understand, but the analysts to understand as well.
Interesting, yeah.
You talk about cinema. We may call it the movie business, same thing. But you talk about how the music business compares to cinema. Talk about that because it's pretty surprising.
So before I went into the tunnel to do this year's report, I was thinking, what's the headline going to be? I mean, last year we announced 41.6 billion. It's probably going to be around that 45 mark. And I remember I sit on the board of the British Screen Forum, which is the trade body for film and TV production here. And I remember asking, what is global box office? And somebody said to me it began with a 4, like 40 odd billion. It's like, maybe that's going to be my headline. Maybe when the numbers all fall together, I'll be able to look over at that other media vertical, to use that expression, cinema, and say, how big are you guys compared to this industry? Now, I want to be clear. Had we had this conversation on your Morning Coffee podcast in 2019, you would have laughed me off the show. You'd have unplugged the microphone. Get out of the studio, Will. You're taking whack crack cocaine or something. Back then, cinema was 33% bigger than music, and both were growing. Music was growing fast, cinema was growing slow, but cinema stacked up at 41.9 billion, music was 31.6. Roll forward to 2023, streaming has been a stay-at-home stock. The live music industry's bounced back. Those collecting societies, Mike, that we discussed earlier, they're collecting more from live music today than they are from general-purpose licensing of hairdressers and hotels. Quite an interesting changing of the guard that's happened. Whereas cinema, since the pandemic, got absolutely whacked and it's really struggled to recover. The strikes didn't help too. So now we have a situation where music stacks up at 45.5 billion, cinema at 33.2, and music is now 38% bigger than cinema. It towers above cinema in absolute and relative terms. And that just sends a signal to the Wall Street analysts of this world. If you think about a racetrack and you've got athletes on a racetrack, music used to be the athlete at the back of the pack, the one that was never going to make it. Now we're passing the pack and we're moving up towards the leaders. Of course, gaming's bigger and subscription video on demand is bigger, but they're not that much bigger. And we're growing like crazy. This is boom time, baby. Where this business is back.
That's fascinating. You mentioned that the shift of attention from linear to non-linear media formats adds to the global value of copyright. Can you unpack that and explain that a wee bit more?
Sure. As you asked, you discussed the expression a wee bit more. I'd love to. Let's go back in history. When radio transferred its medium to Pandora and webcasting, American copyright won hands down. Record labels were getting nothing from radio on the FM and medium wave band in America. It just didn't exist, didn't have the tariff, didn't have the copyright to enforce. But as soon as it came over to Pandora and webcasting, you guys built Sound Exchange, Mike Huppy and the team, and that's what, $1 billion business year on year on year. It's incredible. So that shift, you didn't even get off your sofa, but what technology allowed to happen was for radio to shift from linear passive to online and interactive, and copyright was a benefactor. And I think the point I try and make clear in this report is something similar has happened. We know that cinema's pain has been Netflix gain. We get that. There's nothing rocket science about that. It used to go to the silver screen, now I stay on my sofa. It's closer to the fridge where the beers are at. So we get that point. But regards to the format, the medium being the message here, from passive consumption of the cinema screen to interactive on-demand consumption on the Netflix screen, the tariffs that you apply, at least in Europe, are twice as high for video streaming than they are for cinema. Cinema might pay 1% here in Europe. Netflix would pay 2% of their revenues. B, there's more rights involved. There's a performing right, there's a mechanical right, and there's a sync right for the use. So there's more higher tariffs and there's more rights. And 3, there's more subscribers. So this shift away from the silver screen to our sofas has benefited music so much. And I hacked together a calculation to say, what are we getting from each? And in 2023, cinema globally, maybe $250 million came to the music industry from cinema. From the video streaming market, we're looking at $1.4 billion. So 5 times more coming from the Netflix world than came from the cinema world. So cinema's pain is Netflix gain, and the music industry says, I'll have myself a martini.
You discuss glocalization. And for those that haven't read your report with Chris Dalla-Riva, talk a little bit about glocalization and why it matters.
Well, let's get Chris Dalla-Riva on the podcast because he can pronounce the word better than me. Great guy. You should definitely subscribe to his newsletter. The guy is just oozing class in everything that he writes. But glocalization, in the simplest sentence, says, why is it that local artists in local markets are getting to the top of their local charts in their local mother tongue on global streaming platforms? Contrary to what the theory would have predicted, the world is not flat after all. It's anything but flat. We have seen in the big European countries of Germany, France, Poland, Italy, completely dominated by German, French, Italian, Polish artists. We see anomalies. We see, like in Spain, the entire chart is Spanish language, but you can't break a Spanish act because it's all Latin American artists. We see interesting observations such as Denmark, where 9 of the top 10 artists last year were Danish singing in Danish. Who speaks Danish? It's got a population of 5 million people, 40 million pigs, and some Eskimos in Greenland. But they choose to sing their local mother tongue because they'd rather be a big fish in a small pool than a tiny fish in a humongous pool. So I decided to take this report in 4 directions. 1, I take a look at how some of these poorer countries are cracking the exports into richer ones. That's an interesting concept of trade. How poor countries export to rich ones is how capitalism works. It's how the poor catch up with the rich. 2, I look at the export markets. And in 3, I take an interesting angle in the diaspora, particularly a focus on Canada there. Now, which of those 3 do you want me to unpack for you?
You tell us.
All of them.
I find this so fascinating.
Sure. So I'll keep it as succinct as possible. But if I focus on Colombia and Mexico first, we know that Colombian and Mexican music, be it J Balvin, Peso Pluma, they are absolutely blowing up in the United States, not just with the Hispanic community, crossing over into all the communities. And we know these countries are poor. Their GDP per head, as a relative measure, is about a quarter or a fifth of that of America. So we have poor countries getting their music into rich countries with rich country streams. And those rich country royalties are going to flow back to those poorer countries. So in the report, what I do is I take a look at this and calculate out what is the value of those streams that they've captured in America, and what the value have been had those streams happened in their home country. And let's just stick with Colombia first, because it's the most fascinating. Colombian artists, and there won't be that many of them, J Balvin's going to be an obvious one, captured almost $100 million of streams in the United States last year. That's a lot of streams. Mm-hmm. Had those streams happened in Colombia, they would have only been worth $14 million. So you can see the boost is $78 million. Yeah. $78 million you captured because you exported those streams to rich countries you wouldn't have captured had they happened at home. So what makes that interesting is two things. Firstly, $78 million is more than the entire Colombian music industry is worth. So they're making more money than by exporting to America alone. There's lots of other countries listening to J Balvin, but in America alone, than the entire Colombian industry is worth in dollar terms. And secondly, Jay, isn't it fascinating to see the Colombians have worked out what else they can export to the United States of America? And it's even more addictive than what they previously exported. I mean, reggaeton you listen to every day. But yeah, it's an incredible story, and it wouldn't be too irrational to say this is an example of Spotify. If I use these words, don't call me a douchebag, I think it's the American expression, but alleviating poverty, because this is how trade works. Poor countries export to rich ones. This is what we're seeing. Colombia and Mexico are exporting into the United States and into Canada and into Europe. And that rich money flows back to them. And then the wheels of capitalism begin to turn. So it's a great way to abstract trade.
Wow.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And as you look in your crystal ball, and you're going to be preparing a 2024 report and et cetera, do you envision these trends that we're talking about today to continue? Or is there a sort of a change at some point?
Yeah, maybe if I turn attention to the music exporters, I'll show you where I think the trend is going to take a twist. I looked at who are the music exporters in the world, and this is an example of in the US collects more money in from overseas for the exploitation of their copyright than they send out to those overseas markets. The whole world is listening to American music. They're not listening to many other folks' music. Therefore, they have a positive net balance. So we have 4 countries now, not just 3, 4, which have that positive balance and can call themselves a music exporter. The United States, obviously. Sweden, intuitively. United Kingdom, thankfully, just. And now South Korea. So that's good to know. But then the question is, well, who do you think is going to be the 5th? And Glenn MacDonald, the author of the fantastic book You Have Not Heard Your Favourite Song, a perfect guest for your show, by the way.
We've had him on, yeah.
I said to him, I'm going to publish this tomorrow. You got any ideas for me? He said, I bet you the next country is going to be Nigeria. Mm. Interesting, right? We could have an African country joining the group of 5 as music exporters. And it makes sense when you think it through. The diaspora there is huge. And it'd be interesting to kind of play that game of who's 5th, who's 6th, who's 7th. Could Colombia join that club, for example, as well? So I think that's an interesting way of thinking about which way this market is going to go in the future. Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I'm a huge fan of Bubble Trouble. You know that. After pretty much every episode, I'll write you and, rave about what you guys are talking about.
Tell Richard Kramer, nothing to do with me, man. Richard is the star
it's
of
both
that
of
show.
You two are such a great pair together.
Stand in that guy's shadows.
It's for those who haven't listened, check out Bubble Trouble, the podcast. I don't miss an episode. But talk about Pivot, talk about your business, your reporting, all of that stuff. Where can people learn more about you, Will, and all these fun things that you're involved in?
pivotaleconomics.com. I keep it all up to date and beautifully laid out on that website, pivotaleconomics.com. And you'll find everything about the global value of copyright there, the media coverage, the past reports. You'll find links to Bubble Trouble there as well. And all the other writings I'm doing, such as A Case for Completion, that we discussed on the previous podcast. By the way, just a quick footnote on that. My idea, of course, was that songs that are completed are worth more than songs that are skipped before the end. Do you know that Netflix drops shows when completion falls below 50%?
Really?
Wow.
That surprises me because nobody has an attention span anymore.
Yeah, so when you think that show was doing really well for me, why are you not continuing it? It's because completion rate fell below 50%. Wow. Shows that someone else is thinking about completion as an indicator of intent, right? That's what the whole purpose of my work was. Not completing a song is a negative signal of intent. So how do you punish that negative signal appropriately? And Netflix already do it. So maybe I didn't take a stupid pill after all with that one. Hopefully somebody's listening and we're going to see completion take off. But yeah, all my crazy wacky ideas in music are up there on pivotaleconomics.com. It's there for education, be it students, be it executives. It's a private good for public consumption.
Well, we are longtime listeners, first-time callers. We love what you're doing. Will, keep up the great work, and thank you for spending a little bit of time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love your podcast too. Professionally produced and wonderfully curated.
Thank you, sir.
And you make economics fun, Will, and that's hard to do sometimes.
Blood out of a stone, no?
Yeah, we call Will the bus driver because he takes us to school.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.